All right. Now I will let people in. Good evening, everyone. I'm admitting people. Welcome, welcome, welcome to Starburst, the Speculative Sundays poetry reading series presentations for Women's History Month. March arrived almost with a startlement for me. I don't know about the rest of you. Suddenly, oh my gosh, it was here. Delighted that you are here. I am a cool Leslie Ho. My pronouns are she, her. I learned to say that. Speaking to you from the ancestral land of the Onondaga, also known as the Seneca, keepers of the Western Door in the Southern Finger Lakes region of New York State. I pay homage to the Seneca, past, present, and future, and to my own ancestors by whose grace I exist and am sustained. This series was made possible in part by the Artist Development Grant Program administered by the Arts Council of the Southern Finger Lakes and funded by the Community Foundation of Elmira Corning and the Finger Lakes Incorporated. It was later funded in part by poets and writers with public funds from the New York State Council on the Arts, with the support of the New York State Legislature. And this year, the statewide Community Regrant Program, a regrant program of the New York State Council on the Arts, with the support of the Office of the Governor and the New York State Legislature, and administered by the Arts Council of the Southern Finger Lakes, and enables us to be here. Thank you, all funders of the arts. This reading is being recorded, so if you have concerns, please turn your camera off. Don't show your face if you don't want it to be seen. Let me tell you a bit about the series. Inaugurated in 2020, the series seeks to fix the lack of presentations of speculative poetry by its living creators. Now in its sixth year, the Speculative Sundays Poetry Reading Series has presented 41 hour-long events, including 54 poet readings. Speculative poetry, ancient of days, older than the flood, the poetry of possibilities centers the imagined as real. The first recorded human literature was speculative verse. Gilgamesh, the Ramayana, the Mahabharata, the Iliad and the Odyssey, Beowulf are ancient examples. Speculative poetry includes alternate history, astropoetry, cryptid, cyberfunk, cyberpunk, dystopian, fabulism, fairy tales, fantasy, folklore, futurism, horror, magic, monsters, mythology, occult, paranormal, robots, science fiction, shifters, slipstream, solar punk, solar funk, space opera, superheroes, supernatural, sword and sorcery, sword and soul, steampunk, steampunk, time travel, post apocalyptic, and weird. It takes all poetic forms, plus one of its own called sci fi coup. From nursery rhymes to Edgar Allan Poe's The Raven, from Puff the Magic Dragon to Zombie Jamboree, we've all recited and sung speculative poetry. Let me introduce today's marvelous reader. Jenna Lay is the author of 3 full-length poetry collections: Six Rivers, from NYQ Books, A History of the Cetacean American Diaspora. I love that title. Indolent Books, and an Elgin Award second place winner, Manatee Lagoon, Acre Books. She was selected by Marilyn Nelson as winner of Poetry by the Sea's inaugural sonnet competition. Her poems appear in Agni, Denver Quarterly, Los Angeles Review, Massachusetts Review, Michigan Quarterly Review, Pleiades, Poet Lore, Verse Daily, and West Branch. A daughter of Vietnamese refugees, she has a BA in math and an MD and works as a physician in New York City. Welcome, welcome, Jenna.
Thank you so much, Aqua, for the introduction and for having me here as part of this wonderful project. And speculative poetry has always been such an important part of my involvement in poetry. And hearing you describe as the poetry of possibilities of this, this time is when it's such an important part of what poetry is not just mirroring what is, but looking to what is possible. So I really like that framing. And thank you everyone for coming here. So I thought I would begin by reading some of my poems that have recently appeared in a Starline journal. And I'm going to start with a poem that I know I've performed before. This is a poem. It's called Commander Daphne. And I like to read it. Lately, I find lately is a time period that's going on for quite a while, but I find that when I read the news, sometimes it feels like the struggle for justice and for equality and for liberation just feels like this sort of cyclical Sisyphean process. And this poem sort of reflects that. This is a poem of mine that takes that cyclicity of events as its theme. It's based on the ancient Greek myth of Apollo and Daphne. A lot of my poems go back to various mythologies, including the Greek. But it takes those characters and it relocates them into a futuristic science fiction setting. And this was first published in Starline. Commander Daphne. Her hands, stiff, gauntleted, close leadenly around the spaceship's glassy red door handles. In one bound, she flings her silver-suited body toward the narrow airlock. Heavy-booted legs are first to arrow through the tight, round portal. Next, her thighs in haste slide through. Then, like a girdle, the threshold hugs her waist. But all this time, the swarm's been gaining on her quickly. Shifting shape, it forms a tentacle that thickly coils around her throat as if it would obstruct her breath. She yelps a note into the mouthpiece tucked inside her helmet. This initiates a morph. Her fingers start to hiss like noisy ocean surf, transmuting into cells of energy, pure light. She'll turn up somewhere else, reconstitute her slight corporeal frame someplace it's safer, and start over. She always does. She's raised Apollo like this forever. So yeah, I'm going to read a couple poems that I've never performed before an audience before. I like doing this because I think it makes every poetry reading feel like a more intimate event, more intimate experience. So this is a poem that appeared in the most recent issue of Starline. And I find that different people have different reasons for writing speculative poetry. For me, sometimes it comes back to sometimes writing about what's going on in an imaginary place, another planet is a way into writing about our own. And I think that's sort of what was behind this particular poem. It's called Our Blessed Technologies, Their Barbarous Technologies. There is a planet where the women prevent unwanted births by going to consult a wizard. He casts a spell upon their wombs, brandishing an instrument reforged from melted coins. This spell inflicts a pain that far exceeds all other pain they've ever known. And sometimes it drags on for a draconian length of time as the spell's tendrils often fail to penetrate the womb's full depth and must be knuckled into place, all while the women hiss and grit. No anesthesia is given. The wizard tells the women pain is rare and complications too are rare, although at times the tendrils of the spell escape the womb and plant long barbs in nearby organs. So I'm going to read a poem that this is my first poem, maybe my second poem to ever appear in Starline. This is in this beautiful issue. I still like looking at it because I think it's one of Starline's many gorgeous covers. So this is I guess this would fall under the category of fantasy poetry. If there's others were science fiction poetry, I guess you could think of it as fantasy poetry. And it's called When I Am Asked About My Personal Relationship with Religion. I am a sorceress entrusted with protecting an infant boy named in a prophecy. I am part of a motley band united by this shared purpose. In this band, there's also a deposed king who was once my lover decades ago when I was a palace maid and had not yet learned magic. In those days, my hair was mousy brown, whereas now it is gray striped, having been singed by my spell work. And when I joined the crew, the king recognized me not. I once heard him say to one of his knights, "That lady with her knowledge of the magic arts intimidates me. She knows more than anyone I've ever met." And he keeps his distance accordingly, seldom speaking to me, and only nodding with cold respect when I give him counsel. One time, however, I was tasked with arranging accommodations for our band at a village inn, and I said to Jerome, "Give the king a private room, for mayhap he will wish one of his mistresses to share his room with him." And the king overheard and said, "Why, pray tell, does the magic lady take such an interest in my mistresses?" And I flushed, and since that day I've caught him looking at me more. I would give my life for the infant boy I am sworn to protect, but sometimes I wake up sweating, remembering how the king ogled my younger self, outlined by the window of a palace that no longer exists. Okay, so I'm going to read some poems from my books. I'm going to start with my most recent collection. This is Manatee Lagoon. It came out from Acre Books about 3 years ago now. It's a wonderful press. I know in these times, a lot of presses, it's tough being a small press, and they've been a wonderful press. They've been absolutely lovely to work with, Acre Books. So I'm going to read some of my poems from this collection. It's a collection that's structured around the image of the manatee, which, manatees are an animal that I've always found very intriguing. On the surface, they're sort of, plodding, slow, maybe on visually not the most romantic of animals, but there've been so many mythologies surrounding them, right? I mean, one of the, I'm sure you know that one of the stories behind one of the theories behind where mermaid lore came from is that it came from early attempts by people to describe manatees. So this first poem is the opening poem in the book, and it's called "What the Ancient Greek Sailors Knew." And it sort of it tries to conjure up this sense of delirium, which I think maybe many of us can relate to in what we're going through now. When you're nutritionally imbalanced, too many sodium ions in your blood or too few of potassium, so that the salt-fringed air coaxes music out of your vitamin deficiencies like calliope pipes, and you tremble invisibly like a locust on the airwaves between two radio stations, two opposed political pundits flickering in and out of audible range, as a semi-truck winds down the interstate in the wee hours, a sickly milk sky, uncertain as to whether it is dawn or delirium. The trucker himself uncertain as to whether he is in Illinois or Indiana or merely dreaming. And at any moment, you might be on the verge of zigzagging out of personhood and not know it, because there is no line of chalk, only dolphins. And then it happens. It's happening right now. You're becoming a plaything of raw neurons. And the starlight is squashing your brain's synapses flat with its baby thumbs. And you are surrendering to it because there is nowhere else to go. When this happens to elderly patients in hospitals, doctors call it sundowning, the name implying that when the sun rises, everything will be normal again. But you are only 30, which in ancient Greece might mean you are 2/3 done with your life. And anyway, you're not in a hospital, but out to sea, a place everyone knows doesn't really exist, where creatures that don't exist, called sea horses, are sometimes thrown by the waves on the wood at your feet. And other creatures called manatees, sideways teats, tell you with their sad, huge eyes, they could love you like no land wife ever could. So yeah, a lot of these poems have to do with the mermaid image and the manatee image and how they intertwine in different ways. Yeah, I like to think, we're all different kinds of kids. Some people wish they were vampires or this and that. I was a mermaid kid, and this is a poem about my childhood. What do you want to be when you grow up? It's a ghazal. As an imaginative kid who loved to read about the myth of mermaids, I wanted not to be a doctor or a writer, but a mother of mermaids. I'd heard that if I swallowed whole, tough, translucent tails of shrimp, they'd somehow find their way into my uterus, and then I'd give birth to mermaids. So I would hoard shrimp tails inside a napkin, pop them one by one in secret, then scan my pee with greedy eyes to see if in it slithered mermaids. Some kids inclined toward a witch and a warlock lore. I was too chicken shit. Some kids are drawn to vampires, some to werewolves. Me, I would just rather mermaids. An insecure young girl, I craved the praise of supermarket strangers. I wanted them to gawk. Look, there goes that goddess in whose belly gather mermaids. And like my mom, I longed to parent special kids who could achieve what I could not and swim places barred to me. And therefore, I staked my worth on mermaids. So yeah, so I everyone is different into speculative poetry, I guess. So like for me, a lot of it was fairy tales. I read all the classic fairy tales when I was a kid. I was fascinated by all of them. One that means a lot to me is the 12 Dancing Princesses. I have a lot of poems about the 12 Dancing Princesses. This is one of them. It's a sonnet. It's called the 12 Dancing Princesses. The fairy tale now finished, the Fusilier mulls. Should he marry 16-year-old Lena, his spunky youngest sister, the minx whose ear was sharp enough to hear the harmed larch keen? Or should he wed the eldest, Therese, aged 29, the stern-browed martinet who barked out orders at her ditzy sisters, keeping them in line as their rowboats nosed toward Feyland's reedy borders? There are two versions of this old French legend. In the first version, the romantic one that charmed me as a child, who got piled on for being the smallest, the soldier smiles and says, I choose cherubic Lena, while in the second, my favorite now, he smirks, give me Therese. Yeah, so yeah, I'll read this one. This is I think this I lived in northern New England for a while, and we often the roads would wind. It was sometimes it was from point A to point B. Sometimes there were places that were only a few minutes apart as the crow flies, but it would take like an hour to get there because there were these winding roads and drive by all these farms. And so this is sort of a poem that brings me back here. It's called How We Met. Yeah, and if that other poem was a sort of a metaphorical way of expressing my personal relationship with the religion, I guess this is another way of expressing the same, how we met. I want to confess everything about the cow behind the fence, at whose sight I blurted, "Hey, a horse," so that I then had to pretend it was a horse I saw. What fibs we tell to gloss over the fact God's fly is always down. I looked the other way to spare him unease. That's how I met your blue eyes across the cocktail lounge. And it's how I met everyone I've ever met. So yeah, I don't know if this is because I come from a Vietnamese family, reincarnation is sort of this idea that kind of runs deep in our cultures, as well as many other cultures. I have a lot of poems that sort of have to do with the idea of reincarnation, thinking about different past lives and things. This is also a northern New England poem. The winters would go on a long time, and yeah, especially when you're driving past these ski resorts, and there'll just be like endless like hills of just blank snow. This poem is called "We're All at Least 50% Water," and yeah, the poem comes from this phrase, which is "snow-making whale," which is a term for what they call these man-made piles of snow. They're at the ski resorts, the pressurized snow cannons. They call them snow-making whales. So that inspired this poem. It's also sonnet. In my last life, I was a humpback whale, wide set eyes glowering sidelong from skin folds near my armpits. My grim, fluted lower lip, pocked with drunkard's braille, jabbed up and outward like a shelf of shale, continuing the drab atonal hymn engraved in droning curves along my scummed underbelly, stretching to my tail. My death lacked drama, a mere overflow of days across a sandbar. I'm a snow whale now. No eyes, no lip, just sparkling hump. And when the wind that peppers skiers' eyes lets rip at me, big scoops of me arise, unsew themselves from me, and leave no stump. So I'm going to read one more poem from this collection before I move on to one of my other ones. So yeah, this is one of my few optimistic poems. And once I heard that a friend of mine was putting together an anthology of happy poems, I went through and I went through my books, and it took me a little bit longer than I'm willing to admit. But this is I feel this is one of my optimistic poems, and it's called "Please Don't Tell Me How the Story Ends." A Vermont man, rural, lacerated his knee with a chainsaw doing tree work one summer. The wound festered, not angrily, but with a slow, simmering puzzlement. This lasted years. One day he fingered it, felt something hard inside, pulled out a shiny piece of glass. Another time he pulled a blade of grass out of it, then a whole maple leaf, so perfect it filled Canadian flag makers with envy. Started feeling mighty proud of himself, like King Arthur when he made that stone belch up a sword. Began pulling bigger and bigger things out of his knee, a dime, a dollar bill, a bandana, a quail's egg, and the quail hatched too. He got to calling himself the Wizard, made the circuit of local festivals, state fairs. You'd think this story ends someplace bad. The psych ward, OR, early grave, a wimpled lady shoveling dirt on a corpse that died of 3 parts delusion, 1 part gangrene. But I think the times have just gotten to you. The pessimists opining on TV have dragged you down to their level. The Vermonter, he's still making the rounds, still finding 7-Eleven receipts, perfectly folded road maps and poetry broadsheets tied with slim blue ribbons in his knee. Sometimes butterflies come foaming out, 5 or 6 at once, beating lavender wings. So I'm gonna try to hold on to that optimism. It's sometimes it's tough, but that's part of why we write poetry, right? Is that it sort of crystallizes parts of ourselves that we may need access to later. I'm gonna read some poems from my second collection. This is a history of dissertation American diaspora. Yeah, so I'm just gonna read some of these poems. Some of these I haven't read for a while, which is nice. Nice to bring up these older voices that sometimes don't feel like me anymore, which I wrote. So this one is called Nursery Rhyme. It's called Nursery Rhyme. Jonah was a little worm, a virulent black spit-filled germ that took up lodgings in the churning, aching abdomen of the whale. His calloused, chitinous finger nubs scratched and scraped and drummed and drubbed the puffy, swollen membranes of the aching abdomen of the whale. Did he come to filch the ambergris, or to see the sights of the abyss, the blubber-buttered, krill-encrusted, rubbery rectum of the whale? What jerk would go spelunking here of all the caves that dimple the sphere? What idiot would commandeer my aching abdomen? Groaned the whale. This is another reincarnation poem. Maybe it can be read as a companion of the other one. This is also a sonnet. It's called Transmigration. It's also a love poem. In our first afterlife, we'll rut like buffalo. One day, while we crouch, feral as raccoons, rumps furred by goldenrod at hot high noon, a hunter in a coonskin cap will up and go out the door of his little lop-eared bungalow and impregnate us with buckshot till we swoon. In our second afterlife, we'll be baboons huddled on a hilltop where no hunters go. We'll bite each other's ears and screech with laughter until at last we're snuffed out by old age. Finally, in the third life that comes after, we shall be alligators, tessera covered, wrestling with barrel-chested men on stage by day. By night, we'll wrestle with each other. Yeah, so one story that always fascinates me is this, are these stories where this guy, you see these stories in all cultures, by the way, where like a guy goes into the woods and he's seduced by the fairy queen and he stays there for what he thinks is like 3 days and he comes out, it's been like 100 years. What's fascinating about the story is that I found that there's a version of this story in Japanese culture. They call it the story of Urashima the fisherman. There's a version of the story in Vietnamese culture, and it seems to have arisen independently in like many cultures across the globe, which I guess one way of explaining it is that maybe that makes it more true. So, and this poem is called The Fairy Queen Speaks. Come, kiss me, you scar-faced old-timer. Come embrace me, my post-pubescent pet. Unwind my 100-year-old obi. Strip off my mod designer threads, my green hand-woven kirtle, my Hello Kitty barrette. Let me show you fairyland. Relax, lie back on my recliner. I'm the toast of the town in Ed Cox, Manhattan, and in 8 BC Tibet. What was your name again? Thomas the Rhymer or Urashima the Fisherman? How fast an old dame like me forgets. I'll read a couple more. Yeah, so this is I've written a number of poems recently trying to imagine what the muse is like. You know, the idea that the being visited by some sort of a spirit does the spirit take a form of a person? Is it, you know, what it is a feminine spirit, is a masculine spirit? It's a theme I keep recurring back to. This is one of my early attempts on that theme. It's called "This is How You Subjugate the Muse." First, you cut her hair. You let the clippings drop in a bathtub that has never been wet. When the tub is full, you undress. Shoes last. You lie down in it and wait for the tub's claw feet to spasm, indicating that the strychnine has leached into the marble's veins. They'll clench and unclench, maybe try to scurry. Ignore your quickening heartbeat, a noise like newspaper being crumpled in a distant room. Whatever happens, don't look directly at the green soap, whose upcurled ends resemble a leaf's. The bald god is testing you. The bald god is testing you. Stare hard at the backs of your eyelids till you feel the vibrations of the soap taking flight like an airplane and vanishing. It's time now. Count aloud to 7, allowing a century to each syllable. Then speak the god's name, coquettishly, the way a female owl calls for her chosen mate to bring her a freshly killed rat. So I'll read a couple from my first book. So my first book is Six Rivers. So I should say that the current edition of A History of the Nation American Diaspora is out from Indolent Books, and Six Rivers is out from NYQ Books. So I'll read 2 poems from Six Rivers, and then I'll end it there. Yeah, so this poem was also included. I want to thank you to Akua in Nambano, speculative poetry by poets. It's a sonnet. It's called The Apprentice Pearl Divers. The candles in this room are not so bright as the eyes of the apprentice who misguessed how long a lanky boy with a narrow chest can hold his breath on a pearl dive. Hot nights, his ghost still slinks among the village bunks, beds of the boys who were his friends, lifting the cloths that overlie their naked flanks. He spanks them, teasingly scolding them for sloth. At breakfast the next day, they're too afraid to speak of what they saw. A boy long dead, whose ardent eyes seared holes in their chaste sleep. Uneasily they stand and cross themselves, troop to church in trembling groups of 10 or 12, and when the priest expounds on angels, they weep. So I'm going to end with a poem I used to end all my poetry readings with, and it's an apocalyptic poem. I like to think of it as an upbeat apocalyptic poem, if you will. It's called The Day Before All the Names Changed. It's also from Six Rivers. The 2 ladies' names tattooed on my uncle's forearm read in opposite directions now, but tomorrow both will flow toward magnetic north. If you're planning to get married, it's best to do it tonight before the names all change and then you no longer know whose bloodline you're getting tangled with. Constantine the Accursed, you have the same surname as me already, so we may as well marry each other. Meet me at the Church of St. Cecilia at dusk. Don't be discouraged if the church no longer goes by that name by the time you arrive. It's a sandstone building with blue marble wings. And I'll be the only bride wearing carnations, loops of blood red carnations, and nothing else. Thank you.
Oh my gosh, I'm stunned. You're stopping. Oh, that was so marvelous. You see the applause. You can read the chat later. You're just, it's just really incredible. Let me change the view because I'll put it on gallery so we can see each other together at the same time for the moment. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
I mean, like, wow, wow, wow. Does anybody have any questions? If you do, um, please put them in chat. But I've got some questions until or unless or as the audience may have some. Oh, I see a raised hand. A raised hand. Oh, how does that work? Okay, well, that's great. I can ask Sapphire to unmute and you can ask it, Sapphire.
Hi, I was wondering, what the poem was called that you were talking about the nutrient deficiency?
Oh, yes. That is the first poem in my collection, Mandy Lagoon, and the poem is titled "What the Ancient Greek Sailors Knew."
Okay, what? Okay. Let me hear that one more time. Sorry.
So what the ancient Greek sailors knew.
Greek sailors. Whoa, thank you so much.
My favorite line from that was when you were talking about zigzagging in and out of personhoods
Mm-mm. Thank you.
and the side, yes, yes. And of course the last line about how one is loved.
Mm-hmm.
Yay, yay, yay. Okay, so here's a question from the audience. Why, why? Now that's interesting. Why does mythology inspire you so much?
Yeah, it's a yeah. The why is what makes the question so interesting.
Exactly,
Yeah.
exactly. Yeah.
I could tell you a bit about my. Yeah, I remember. Yeah, when I was a kid, they had the scholastic book fairs at school, and I remember. You always try to pick up. Yeah, and that was I think one of those book fairs is where I got a picture book of the Greek myths. It was beautifully illustrated. The illustrators, yeah, these things don't get enough credit because really that's sometimes you pick up when you're a kid you pick up books and it's got beautiful pictures and this one had beautiful pictures. I wish I knew who the illustrators were off the top of my head, but yeah, that book I kept with me a long time. And I think yeah, I mean we often try to protect our kids from a lot of things like violence and sex and things like that. But like if it happens in the Greek myths, like who can stand in the way of that? This is my first introduction to a lot of these, and it's same thing with fairy tales. So this is I guess the Greek myths uh, was my first exposure to a lot of these ideas about people betraying each other and people seducing each other and all these raw human emotions that maybe people don't want to talk to young people about, but which are nonetheless fascinate young people so much. It's kind of I have a daughter who's 2 years old, and her two favorite songs right now are one about being sad, one about being mad. And I think it's because of society. We try to tamp down the negative emotions. We're like, don't be sad, don't be mad. And I think it was like that. I think I was drawn to the Greek myths initially A, because of the gorgeous pictures, and B, it's just all these raw undercurrents of emotion, often very illegal, wrong emotions that were felt by the characters. And yeah, I mean, I keep coming back. A lot of these stories are just so rich. Like the story of Cupid and Psyche was, I think, my first favorite Greek myth, and it's such an incredibly powerful story. I mean, there's so many layers to it, right? I mean, I come back to it now. I have a poem in my the Station American Diaspora about it. I'm writing some poems now about it because I think there's just so much to that story. That Psyche, she goes and lies on this hillside expecting to essentially sacrifice herself and die, and then she's found by this mystery husband who and that's also a story that exists in like so many different cultures, right? There's so many different cultures where we have this story where someone falls. I don't know if love is the right word for it, but some magical bubbling force that we could refer to as love develops between people who've never actually seen each other face to face. There's stories and there's a Scandinavian story that's very similar to Cupid and Psyche, that east of the sun, west of the moon. There's stories in Vietnamese culture and various East Asian cultures that have some similarities as well. So I think it's partly the universality of these stories. Yeah, it speaks to some sort of that they run in our blood at a level deeper than geography, deeper than time. Yeah, so I'm drawn to mythologies of all kinds. Greek mythology is probably my first mythology, but I've become more and more interested in Vietnamese folk tales over the years, various folk tales and various cultures, which there's so many wonderfully rich mythologies around the world. They have so many strange overlaps with one another. And yeah, so yeah, Cupid and Psyche is the one that grips me the most now. I don't know, it's because I grew up obviously as like a very ugly child, and like people I knew it. No, some people you're like, oh, don't say that, but like obviously as a kid, like you knew it. Like no one ever would tell you you're pretty. And yeah, so I've always been drawn to this idea of people like yeah, I'm very drawn to this idea of people forming a bond that's deeper than appearances. I think that's a theme that just speaks to me very, very, very deeply. So yeah, and so many of these myths have these themes. I think stand the test of time.
Wow, that's wonderful insight. I think too of, his name escapes me, Hero with the Thousand Faces man, who sadly I've read and watched his whole series, and his name is not coming to me. But just to speak to the commonality. I keep wanting to say Jung, but that's the psychological end. I was trying to remember the name of the guy who did it on the literary end. Thank you, someone. Thank you, Mary. Joseph Campbell. Joseph Campbell. Yes. Thank you, Mary. Helping each other out. Yes, yes, yes. So any other questions for Jenna? Well, think about them, because I have like a page full, just in case any of you were remiss. But always upon hearing what she selected, new things come to mind versus the old things. But let's cover some of the old bases, which is, when did you begin writing poetry?
Yeah. So I was fortunate to have parents who sort of really emphasized books and poems. We had, poems and books floating around. I probably didn't write my first, yeah, I wrote my first serious poem. I think I was about 13. Yeah, I still remember it. It's a fresh memory. We had a stat, in the old days, you'd print up things on paper, and then if you had a typo, you would throw it on the trash paper stack so that somebody could use the other side of the paper, so you weren't wasting paper. So I wrote my first poem on the back of a sheet of throwaway paper. It's a poem about autumn, and these are almost this memory. Yeah, I remember just being, just loving the sounds of words and just putting sounds together. I remember having the word fleeting and the word flitting, and just thinking, fleeting, fast to fly. I was just like drunk in the sounds of words. And I think, around the time I was maybe 13, 14. And then I've really never, I've had, like everybody, I've had dry periods since then, but I've really written I've written since then. I've written every year since then.
Talk to us about your love of the sonnet, please.
Yeah, I absolutely love the sonnet. I will proselytize for the sonnet until I die. I love that the sonnet has, I love that the sonnet has always been a mouthpiece for love, or for people who are in, desperate love. I think that was something that drew me to it, that, the greatest sonnets were sonnets of just desperate, hopeless love. I love that the sonnet is a form that has been, there've been so many great women practitioners of sonnets over the years, like one of the greatest early French poets, Louise Labé, one of the greatest early French women poets, wrote most largely in the sonnet form. In the English language, we have, Elizabeth Barrett Browning, we have Christina Rossetti, people who, and I say Vincent Millay, my eternal love, would write these just transgressive poems of love, where often the women would show, so much agency. I think that's what, drew me these are poems where you could talk without shame about things that were about feelings that were transgressive, feelings that, about wanting, about wanting, about desiring. Or if you did talk about shame, you could talk about a way where you owned your shame. It was a form that I just associate with just great agency, great, that you're not just a plaything of others. That you could express a voice of agency, a voice of wanting. Yeah, and I think it's such a
that's
beautifully.
so profound.
Yeah, I love the form. I think especially in the English language, it's a form that thoughts fall naturally into. I don't say this to show off, but just to like sometimes there are at least a couple of times I've like started writing. I posted a picture on like Facebook, and I would just start writing a caption, and then it'll just become a sonnet. Just because I think it's so easy. Thoughts just I feel like human thought it's just the right size for like a lot of thoughts, a lot of feelings just fall naturally into the shape and size of the sonnet. When we're arguing with ourselves, having the turn at the end, the epiphany at the end. It just fits so naturally with the way thoughts occur to us. So yeah, I find that it's often like when I'm having writer's block, it's a form that just feels like it comes more naturally than maybe some other forms.
Which sonnet form do you prefer?
Um,
Is there
yeah,
one, or do you cycle through all of them, or?
I once decided to do an inventory of every sonnet I'd ever written, and I find I often fall at the boundary between Shakespeare and Petrarchan. Like I'll often start ADDA, and then maybe CDDC, but then eventually I want to come back to that final. I love the couplet at the end, so even if I start Petrarchan, I'll end up Shakespearean. I find that happens to me a lot. I love all variants of sonnet form. It's a rima sonnets, like all variants. But I do find often it's a sort of mix. I love the octave sestet, like a dialectic. So often I'll start Petrarchan and then end Shakespearean. That's often the way. I don't plan ahead. It's just how it sometimes it goes. So
I'm just amazed and engaged and delighted that you are committed to this formalism through the speculative. But again, my mind is blown by what you said about your engagement with the love poems as love poems giving that permission and
mm-hmm.
agency and the transgressive feelings. Those are some powerful, powerful statements. So when does the speculative enter into your concerns? You weave it all in so magnificently.
Yeah, it's different ways, different times. I think every poem needs a seed of something that just transcends the linear or the right. I mean, if I find that sometimes I start to bore myself if it's like Lorca with the Duende. If you become too intellectualized, too logical, too linear, then you start to bore yourself, and then what's the point of writing anymore? So often that's the moment when the wiser part of me realizes I have to sort of sit back and let something speculative enter the poem. That comes in a lot of it comes in a lot of ways. I mean, yeah, and sometimes it's through myth, sometimes it's through fairy tale, sometimes it's through something more science fiction like. A lot of different ways, I guess.
So you talked about the eminence of mermaids for you,
Mm-hmm.
and Psyche and Cupid. What puts you in thrall of the 12 dancing princesses?
Yeah, I think I remember my first favorite books somebody gave me a copy of a picture book of the 12 Dance Princesses when I was 4 or 5. And I think part of it was the dresses. I remember the illustration of the dresses in the book were beautiful. Like, I've become very interested in dress history recently. It's every dress in the book was like a different kind of dress. There's like, but it was a beautifully illustrated edition. And, but yeah, I love this idea. It at its heart, the story of Tom Dance Princess is a story about, individuating and rebelling against one's parents, right? I think I realized that I latched onto that right away, right? It's a story about a father who tries to lock away his daughters, and so that he can sort of control their sexuality, control who they are. And they have this secret life where every night, essentially in their dreams, they go out and do what they want. And I think that even when I was very little, I knew that something, I recognized that transgressive element there. And I think that was what initially drew me to it. Yeah, and I think it has to do with, the appeal of nighttime, right? The appeal of, when you go to bed, yeah, and you enter a dream state. Anything can happen. This idea that there's this other that, yeah, there's this daytime world where people are going to have various demands on you, but then when at night in the dream state, you can you can dance with, a stranger. You become this other person. And I think that, I mean, there's something Jungian about that, but like I think I was fascinated by that as well.
Wow. So when did the speculative enter for you? Did it enter at the same time at 13, or is this later?
Yeah, when I first started writing poetry, I knew I wanted to write love poetry. I think different people are drawn to poetry in different times. And yeah, for me, yeah, it was very, I knew yeah, I wanted to write love poetry. And yeah, and then looking for what models to use. You think back to the fairy tales, you think back to the myths. And so that, I guess it was always hovering there to some extent. Like so many of the great love poets, right? I mean, like for Perseus, I mean, it was always calling back to myth, trying to, you have a feeling, you have a desire that, might be subversive, that might be strange. So you try to legitimize it by saying, oh, it's like that God did, it's like, those nymphs did it all the time. So like, I think
Blame it on them. Yes.
yeah. So I think, yeah, there was always that open conduit between, I think, mythology and what I was doing, I think.
How does this integrate though? Your work life is so separate from this. Do you ever include aspects of your profession in your writing?
I mean, in different ways. Rarely do I do it in a very literal way. I mean, I think my work has made me very aware of the body in different ways, like of every of its temporal nature, of its spatial nature. And I think that's sort of, I think about, I think sort of inevitable working in a healthcare setting. You start thinking about, you spend a lot of time thinking about pain. You spend a lot of time thinking about degeneration of the body and things. So I think a lot of those concerns do enter my work, but rarely is my work. Occasionally I might write about a specific experience I've had, but usually it's a more indirect connection.
Deliberately? Do you want to keep separate, or is it
I think so. I mean, to me, poetry is yeah. I think there. I know that there's a school of thought that 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 immersion in literature can make people into better healthcare providers, and but I think and I think to some extent that's true. But I think there's also I think some of the subversive, I think, gets lost when one tries to combine the two pathways too closely. It becomes too much of a I think I always want to leave room for the subversive, the eccentric, and the not quite fitting in. So yeah, so to some extent, I think it is necessary to keep them to a certain extent separate. You don't want your poetry to be beholden too much to external claims too much, I think.
What's your writing routine like? What makes a poem begin? Do you journal? Do you take notes? Is there
Yeah. Often it's kind of funny. I really when I once I write a poem, I rarely revise. I don't, this makes me sound like I feel weird saying this. It makes me sound like a fraud, but frequently, like I write it and then it's done. So my routine, such as it is I'll sit down to write, and then I'll just follow that thread, like, like or Ariadne's thread, wherever until it's done, and some of them,
Ariadne's thread. Okay.
some of them I'll end up keeping, and some of them I won't. That's the reality of it. I write a lot, and some of them I'll realize are worth keeping, and some of them I'll just kind of stow away. But honestly, a lot of the poems I've written that I've liked over the years are kind of came out in one go. I'm not a big reviser. I'm very I'm a big proponent of viewing poetry as work that you don't wait to be struck by the if you wait to be struck by the lightning of inspiration, then you're sort of selling short. You gotta go out every day, cast your fishing nets. So my routines, I go out, I write, and then some days it's bad, and then you just pack it up, you go home, and then you throw your nets again the next day. So
I love that metaphor, casting your nets upon the water daily. You're a worker.
Yeah. I think there's such a strong history of work. Like, I mean, I think I like to think poets as being sort of sisters of people who did needlework or people who make armor. It's a it's a you're making something where there wasn't something before, but it's a form of work. It's not yeah. So that's yeah.
We've got a comment. I like this from Mary because it's true. There's lots about water in your work.
Yeah, I think it's true. I thought all the titles of all three of my collections have all had to do with the water. I mean, the first one had rivers in it, and yeah, yeah. And I think I don't know. Yeah. I mean, I think it has to do with what draws me to the writing process, sort of that the unexpected part, like the fluid nature of it, right? Like if it was too dry, it was too predictable, then what would be the point of it? So maybe that's my way of trying to keep the conduit open between myself and the duende of work. I don't know, but yeah, the fluidity of it.
Oh, so it's not about a particular body of water that you're
Kind of funny. I grew up. Yeah, I mean, I grew up not. I mean, sometimes I think about the closest body of water to where I grew up was the Mississippi River, but honestly, I didn't spend that much time looking at it. We didn't go out to it that much. I mean, I think, but then we have the rivers within around the aorta is the great river of the body. So in some ways, we're inseparable from water. It runs literally in our blood. So.
Thank you, Jenna. Are there any other questions? Because we're almost out of time. Pause for no. Well, okay, so we got some thank yous. I just want to say, now let's see, I want to put this on the view so that we see you. This is marvelous. I wanted to ask one last little thing, which is your titles are phenomenal. Some of them are just breathtaking. And do you ever, this has been a discussion I saw in a recent poet group. Do you ever have challenges with your titles? Because they're all so spot on.
Oh, I do. I frequently, I frequently doubt them. Yeah, no, A History of Cetacean American Diaspora is a book that is titled after one of its poems. I remember when I first brought this poem to a sort of workshop, everyone was like, you can't keep that title. You got to get rid of that title. Yeah, I mean, so sometimes I try to lean into I lean into the eccentric maybe too much. I don't know. But I think you just kind of have to listen. I don't know if you have. I just listen to my gut. I try to lean into the eccentric because I try to lean into my obsessions because I feel like that's who I am. I don't know. Sometimes it might work, sometimes it might not. Yeah. I mean, yeah, it's kind of funny. You write poems for decades, but rarely you rarely want to use the same title twice. There's so many titles out there. It's interesting.
What you chose tonight was just so strikingly moving and evocative and so on point. And we enjoyed it enormously. And thank you, Jenna.
Thank you. Yeah, this has been a wonderful, wonderful time for me. And yeah, I mean, I know it's hard. It's been hard writing lately. A lot of things.
I have a quick question.
Okay.
Yeah.
If for Jenna, do you have an Instagram or any social media that,
Oh, I
you know?
do. It's Jenna Lee Writing. Jenna Lee Writing is my Instagram.
Oh, generally writing. Okay, okay. Oh, great. Thank you.
So thank you for that, Sapphire. And I will now say farewell, be well, everyone stay safe and warm. Thank you again, Jenna Lay. And I hope you all will join us next Sunday, same time, with another poet in Starburst, the Speculative Sundays Poetry Reading Series. And that poet will be Jennifer Crow. Thank you, Jenna, and good night, everyone.
Thank you, Akua. Thank you, everybody. Good night, everybody.
Peace.